Rings of Power Season 2 is an absolute abomination. I thought I would have learned my lesson after Season 1 to not waste my time with this show. But you know what they say, once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it. So I once again have subjected myself to enduring another 9 or so hours of this godforsaken garbage. There is so much wrong with Rings of Power Season 2 that one could go on for hours and hours and hours nitpicking every detail, and trust me, some people have. But I'm gonna do my best to explain why I think Rings of Power Season 2 sucks as concisely as I can. So the best place I think to start off is by taking a look at the main plot, which is the driver of the whole story, that of course being Sauron and Celebrimbor forging the Rings of Power. Not only are there a plethora of problems and story beats that don't make sense in the storyline, but the problems found here also leak over to the other subplots developing problems as well. At the end of Season 1, we see Sauron making his way into Mordor. Why exactly he goes back to Mordor is unclear, but that is the final scene of the season. At the beginning of Season 2, skipping over the prologue, he has for some reason decided to turn himself into Udar's army. Why has he done this? I have no clue. He has nothing to gain by doing this. Sauron, who is still masquerading as Halbrand, tells Udar that Galadriel has now seeked out the help of a dark sorcerer, and that if he sets him free, that he can find out where he is and lead Udar's army right to him. Udar has no reason whatsoever to trust that Halbrand will do this or keep his end of the bargain, but does it anyway after he, quote-unquote, swears allegiance. Halbrand rides off to Eregion, implying to Udar's army that Sauron is in fact hiding in Eregion. The fact that Sauron baits Udar's army into attacking Eregion in the first place, where he is later going to be continuing his work on forging the Rings of Power, is really stupid on his part and makes no sense, but I'll touch on that more when we get to it. So Halbrand makes his way back to Eregion, which is extremely risky on his part because he has no idea whether or not Galadriel has spread the news to the rest of the elves that Halbrand is in fact Sauron, but the writers treat this scenario like it isn't even a possibility because Galadriel in fact didn't tell anybody, which is probably one of the dumbest character decisions I have ever seen. If Galadriel does in fact tell the elves, in particular the elves in the realm of Eregion, which she has absolutely no reason not to, the true identity of Sauron, then the entire plot of Season 2 does not happen. But the writers forgo this basic common sense, continuing the legacy of this version of Galadriel being one of the most narcissistic and stubborn people I have ever seen. She decides not to admit to the fact that she was blind from the beginning, and unable to properly warn Celebrimbor of this man because they need the plot to happen. Can you imagine what would have happened if Galadriel would have just told Celebrimbor, yeah, that man that you crafted the 3 elven rings with, that was Sauron. Ah, Celebrimbor, my friend, it is me, totally not Sauron, and I have come to forge more rings. Kill him. What? But because Celebrimbor doesn't know this information, he eventually decides to shelter Halbrand for the time being after Halbrand dangles the "I have the information about the 3 rings that you really want to know about" lure right in front of him. After Halbrand tells Celebrimbor that the elven rings have worked wonders, he then suggests that they should make rings to help save the race of men. Celebrimbor hates that idea and shoots it down, so the conversation quickly shifts over to the dwarves. Halbrand tells Celebrimbor that the dwarves are having great problems of their own to try and convince Celebrimbor to create rings for dwarves. The massive issue with this being that there is no way that Halbrand should even know about what's going on in Khazad-dûm. The problems that they are having with their mountain literally just happened, and there is no indication from the story that any call for aid has been sent out in that brief time due to King Durin's stubbornness. So why would he know this? After Celebrimbor is still apprehensive to make rings for dwarves, Halbrand transforms into Anatar, telling Celebrimbor that he is a god sent from the Valar and the giver of gifts or something like that, presumably changing Celebrimbor's perception of him. Celebrimbor isn't suspicious of this at all and just goes along with it, and the episode ends. And by the next time we pick up with these two, they're forging the dwarven rings. So Anatar convincing Celebrimbor to forge rings for dwarves, and Celebrimbor ultimately agreeing to it, all happens off screen. You'd think that that would be one of the most important aspects to the overall narrative, but it isn't even shown. If that doesn't speak for itself of how much of a problem that is, then I don't know what to tell you. When the dwarven rings are eventually completed, and Celebrimbor and Anatar gift the rings to King Durin, the rings don't behave in a way which would align with Sauron's ultimate goal, that being to rule over all the peoples of Middle-earth. As soon as King Durin puts on the ring, he starts going absolutely insane. Although it does give him some powers, it fundamentally changes who he is as a person. He becomes extremely greedy, taxing his people to an extreme amount. He seemingly loses all common sense, becoming extremely reckless and breaking his own mining laws that he signed off on years ago. And this reckless digging could very well be the destruction of not only himself, but his entire mountain. Now, why would Sauron help manipulate the rings in a way that makes the dwarves behave like this? You'd think that these rings would give the dwarves immense power, but slowly dwindle their minds into eventually worshipping their creator with the help of the one ring that Sauron will eventually forge, or something like that. But instead, within the span of a couple days seemingly, King Durin goes batshit crazy. And if that wasn't Sauron's intention, then that really nerfs Sauron overall, and would just imply that he doesn't really have any control over the power that goes into these rings or what they will actually do to people's minds. The excuse that the writers give is in the form of a throwaway line, "We brung deceit into the process." That's the excuse? Of course deceit was brung into the process. You're the master deceiver. I cannot believe that that's the excuse that the show gives for why they don't work properly. And Celebrimbor just blindly believes that that's the reason the rings aren't working, because Annatar said so. The fact that Annatar is so effortlessly able to string Celebrimbor along like this speaks more volume to Celebrimbor's gullibility more so than Annatar's intelligence. That's another problem in of itself, is that Celebrimbor is way too gullible. He does not in any way come across as one of the wisest elves in Middle-earth. It's not like Annatar has used that inconceivable of tactics to manipulate Celebrimbor in the way that he has, where you'd get the sense that Celebrimbor is just some puppet on a string and Annatar is the puppet master. And Sauron doesn't even use any of his powers until he creates the realm to trap Celebrimbor inside his own head. I think the worst example of this is when Celebrimbor refuses to make the 9 rings for men because he believes that the race of men will ultimately be too corrupted by the power that the rings possess. But when Annatar says something along the lines of, "Well, if you're not going to help me make the rings, then I'll just make them myself," and then Celebrimbor just goes along with it? If you were so concerned about these 9 rings getting made, and you absolutely did not want to make them, then just kick Annatar out. He doesn't have to be there, this is your realm. And even if the result of trying to do that results in Annatar revealing himself to be Sauron, then at least he would have had to reveal himself much earlier than he would have wanted to. And the creation of the 9 rings would have been an act of him enslaving you from the beginning, rather than you falling for the obvious manipulation. But anyways, the only reason that Sauron has to trap Celebrimbor inside of his mind is because Adar and his army are now on the doorstep of Eregion, something that he for some reason self-inflicted on himself. I still do not understand why Sauron, who was posing as Halbrand at the time, would lure Adar into following him to Eregion. Wouldn't it be much better for him to have the luxury of time on his side, so that him and Celebrimbor could forge the rings in peace without having to worry about any outside threats? And even if you argue, sure, he could have done that, but he wanted to lure Adar and the Orc army to Eregion so that he could take them over, that's still a dumb plan. He already tried to take over the Orc army. That was the whole prologue, and he failed miserably. They stabbed him like 4,000 times. It's not like the circumstances have changed much since then. If anything, it's gotten worse for him since Adar has proven himself to be a leader that cares about the orcs and their well-being, since apparently that's what the orcs so desire in this show, a loving father figure. What's going to be Sauron's pitch to the orcs this time? Because it hasn't changed. He still wants to rule over all the peoples of Middle-earth, so I don't know how he's gonna spin it this time to get the orcs to side with him. But hey, what do you know? I guess he figured out a way to do it off-screen, because the orcs have decided to betray Adar and now worship Sauron. Oh my god, who wrote this? Who wrote this? This plot gap is probably even worse than the creation of the Dwarven Rings. At least in the case of the Dwarven Rings, you could imply that Annatar could have convinced Celebrimbor to forge them because he was masquerading as a god, but this shit makes no sense based on what the show has established about the orcs. There is no logical way that you can fill in the gaps here. All the orcs have cared about this whole season is worshipping a master who cares about them, and defeating their enemies so that they can live in peace. So how is Sauron an upgrade from Adar to accomplish this goal? Do they really think that the guy who is experimenting on orcs to try and create weapons over flesh really gives 2 shits about you? Just look at what he did to Glug. Rest in peace, Glug, by the way. But hey, I guess we shouldn't ask questions, right? I guess we should just go along with it and pretend like it actually makes sense because the plot needs to happen. The storyline wraps up with Sauron stabbing Galadriel right in the heart area with his evil crown. She falls off the side of a massive cliff and somehow survives. From that height, she should have broken every single bone in her body. She should be a pile of mush right now, but nope. She's fine, guys, she's fine. She's got level 100 plot armor. And that about wraps up that storyline for the season. There are of course a number of other narrative inconsistencies and plot holes littered throughout this Eregion plot, but to discuss them all would take literal hours, so I just chose to highlight the ones that I found the most damaging. If you actually do have literal hours to spare though, and want to dive into every single plot hole, I'd check out Random Film Talk's video. He probably sums it up better than anybody. Now before I move on to the other subplots, since we were just discussing the rings and how they relate to Sauron and Celebrimbor's decision making, I want to highlight another big issue that I have with season 2, and that is the rings themselves, and the frustratingly vague explanations and depictions that the show gives us on how they work. After all, this show is called The Rings of Power, so you'd think that the rings themselves would get a great deal of attention and very detailed explanations on how each of them were crafted, why the way each of them were made makes them so powerful, what exactly the rings can do and cannot do, and how Sauron might have corrupted each of them. But sadly, this aspect is incredibly underdeveloped. Let's start with the 3 Elven rings. The construction of the 3 rings goes back to season 1, where all we really know is that they are made out of mithril, gold from Valinor, and topped off with these gemstones. Why do these 3 properties mixed together produce a magical and powerful set of rings? We don't really know. The only answer that is given to us is that mithril has magical properties, I guess. Why does mithril, a specific type of metal, have magic properties? How can this power of mithril be used in the form of a ring? All this goes unanswered. The 3 rings showcase a wide variety of powers. The ability to heal being the major one, as the elves heal the magic tree, as well as multiple examples of them healing the flesh. We also see Círdan being able to manipulate fish. The 7 rings for dwarf lords are constructed using mithril, once again, but the other ores used are never really said to my knowledge. Now, do the dwarf rings have the same powers as the elven rings, considering they both contain magic mithril? It's never really said, but we can only assume. We see King Durin gain super strength. Why this ring filled with mithril specifically gives King Durin super strength when surely the dwarves of all people have other objects throughout the kingdom that are made of mithril? Don't know. The show never elaborates on it. The ring seemingly gives Durin transparent-like vision, where he's able to see the mountain in other ways that no other dwarf can. And finally, he's able to heal the mountain? This makes absolutely no sense. Why would this ring, filled with mithril, be the cause of the mountain's healing when the mountain is literally littered with mithril? This is such an obvious flaw, I don't know how it was overlooked. Seems like the writers forgot to bring their brain cells to work that day. And finally, we have the 9 rings for mortal men doomed to die. Sadly, these are the group of rings that are by far the most overlooked in the show. We get no indication whatsoever as to what the powers of the rings of men are. Now, I will give the show a little bit of slack, as we haven't gotten to the part of the story where the 9 rings have made it into the hands of any men, but that doesn't excuse the fact that the construction of the 9 is just completely glossed over. These are the set of rings that I'm actually the most intrigued by, because I want to know how the power within them eventually leads to the kings of men becoming the Nazgul, as we later see in The Lord of the Rings. Now, the show of course still has time to do this, and will most likely attempt to do it in later seasons, but I have no faith that it's going to be written well. What are the rings for men made out of besides Sauron's blood? And why was Sauron's blood able to be a substitute for mithril when they most definitely have very different properties? And is that the only thing that makes them different? Sauron's blood? Is the blood of Sauron the reason that these rings are indestructible? All these questions I don't know the answer to, and the show doesn't care to elaborate on them. If I'm starting to sound redundant, then that's probably because I am, but that's not my fault, that's the show's fault. If you want to chalk this all up to the rings have those powers because Sauron influenced them and put some of his magic shit in them, I guess you can do that, but we never actually see Sauron doing anything like that. So I'm not just going to assume anything just because it's Sauron. The writers leave so much unexplained, and the few explanations that they do give are so unspecific that it left me extremely angry and disappointed. It's very hard to get invested in these magical items if we have so little to no understanding of how said magic items function and the limitations that they have. They really have to step up their game when it comes to this stuff in season 3, because this is perhaps the most essential part of the show. Now, with that being said, before I eventually dive into the subplots and plethora of bad character writing, numerous other plot holes, and terrible writing decisions that each of those possess, I think that this is a good place to cap off part 1. welcome everybody to part 2 of my mini-series analyzing why the Rings of Power sucks. If you haven't seen part 1 and would like to watch that video first before watching this one, then the link to there will be in the description. However, you don't have to watch part 1 first in order to understand part 2, so if you just want to watch part 2 first and then watch part 1 after, that's totally fine as well. So today we are going to start taking a look at all the subplots present in Season 2. They are all terrible, but some I do think are noticeably worse than others. So today specifically, we are going to take an in-depth look at the Linden subplot as well as the Mordor subplot. We'll start with Linden since they are the protagonists in the story, so let's jump straight in, shall we? The season starts off with Galadriel chasing Elrond for the 3 Elven Rings of Power. This entire scene is all pretty dumb because this entire chase could easily stop if Galadriel would just tell Elrond that the rings were forged by Sauron. And Elrond would have ultimately agreed because he didn't want to use the rings after he knew that they were forged by Sauron. When the rings are delivered by Elrond to the High King, for all of his supposed wisdom, he decides to use the Elven rings that very well may have been corrupted by Sauron. His justification is that if they don't use the rings, then the peoples of Middle-earth might be subjected to the tyranny of the Dark Lord. The key word there is might. If you really wanted to use the Rings of Power but don't want to risk Sauron's corruption, there's an obvious solution here. Just make more Rings of Power that aren't corrupted by Sauron in any way. Celebrimbor knows how to make them now, so why doesn't he just make new ones? Is the show really trying to say that they have to use these specific rings right now? Why? Because the last leaf will fall? Just take a couple more weeks to forge some new rings and then heal the tree. Why are you acting so irrationally as if you're going to die in a matter of seconds if you don't use these rings? I don't know, it's all so stupid. It's all so contrived just so the plot can happen, even though it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you give further explanation as to why this has to occur. But the show doesn't really explain why they have to do this right now beyond, our time will end. What does that even mean? You can't just throw generic-ass statements out there and expect us to know what you're talking about. After Elrond refuses to hand the rings over to Gil-galad because he believes they likely have been corrupted by Sauron, he jumps off the side of a waterfall to escape with the rings, to seek out someone who he can trust. He makes his way to Círdan, who we are told is the oldest and wisest of all the elves in Middle-earth. Elrond tells Círdan the circumstances in which the rings were crafted and why he's so worried about their possible corruption. And Círdan agrees because he proceeds to ride out to the Bay of the Sea to cast the rings into the depth of the ocean. But looks like he changed his mind. Looks like Elrond was right. The rings definitely look like they're corrupting him. And the logic that Círdan gives later for why he has ultimately switched sides is beyond stupidity. That being, you wouldn't cast away the writings of a great poet just because he was a drunkard. Therefore, we shouldn't cast away these beautiful and powerful rings just because they were made by Sauron. Now, while I understand his logic about the poet, there's a pretty significant difference between a drunk poet and the Satan of Middle-earth. So no, your logic does not make sense in this situation, and you probably were just corrupted by the rings, proving Elrond right. Círdan then goes to deliver the 3 rings to Gil-galad, and despite all of Galadriel's constant fuck-ups, she is allowed to keep one of the 3 elven rings. Despite withholding the information to properly warn Celebrimbor that Halbrand, the man that he crafted the 3 elven rings with, and a man that may very well return, she is for some reason allowed to keep one of the 3 elven rings of power. This is absolutely insane why she is allowed to do this. And I guess the best explanation we can give for this is, the ring chose her, I guess. I guess this Galadriel just gets to keep the ring because in the eyes of the writers, she can do no wrong, because she faces 0 consequences for her actions. Anyways, King Gil-galad begins preparations for an invasion of Mordor, but also decides to send Elrond and Galadriel on a side quest to Eregion after he and Galadriel have disturbing visions of Celebrimbor and the fate of Eregion. This is where the Linden plot splits into 2. So for now, we'll follow Elrond and Galadriel and cycle back to Gil-galad when it's appropriate. So Galadriel, Elrond, and a small company of elves set off for Eregion. All goes well until they reach a broken bridge that they determine has been destroyed by Sauron, because apparently Sauron knew that a company of elves was going to take this exact route in an effort to stop him. Seems a little far-fetched, don't you think? And of course, this is the only safe and efficient route to get from Linden to Eregion in any timely manner. You'd think that the elves of all people would have multiple roads, routes, and bridges that would connect their seemingly 2 biggest cities, but nope, they don't. So I guess they're going to have to go through the super evil forest that totally is an excuse to have a fight scene, because it's the only other way in which they can get to Eregion in any timely or efficient manner. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to having something go wrong in which our heroes are forced off the path that they were headed on. The most obvious example that I can think of from Middle-earth that just comes to the top of my head is the scene in Desolation of Smaug, in which the company of dwarves are forced to go through Mirkwood even though they all know it's dangerous. But in the case of that scenario, there was actually a reason for why they decided to go through the spooky forest. The forest was hundreds of miles long, and trying to go around it would have added weeks to their journey, and they were also actively being hunted by orcs. But in Rings of Power, it's written this way because the writers want to add in an unnecessary fight scene in order to add tension that feels entirely forced, not something that was built up to very well by the story. But anyways, they enter the spooky forest and come into contact with the Barrow-wights. And besides the fact that this fight scene is very forgettable, there are also some conflicting elements of knowledge that's really bizarre in the way that it plays out. So right when the Barrow-wights reveal themselves, I believe it's Asian Elf that asks, "What are those things?" And Galadriel responds with, "They're Barrow-wights." About 30 seconds later, another elf says, "They're impervious to our weapons." And about 30 seconds after that, Elrond says something along the lines of, "According to ancient lore, you have to use the weapons that they were buried with in order to kill them." Cause apparently, Elrond has a deep knowledge on the lore of Barrow-wights. Elrond, why are you telling us this now? You don't think this would have been good to know 2 minutes ago? You just had to wait for one of your elf companions to get eaten by the forest butthole and everyone almost die for you to reveal this critical information? After the fight concludes, Galadriel says that something evil has awoken them. If you haven't caught on yet, seemingly every time this show needs an explanation for why something occurred, but there is no obvious reason for that occurrence, the writers just chalk it up to, it was Sauron doing evil magic shit off screen. That's why the bridge was broken, that's why the Barrow-wights attacked, and that's why seemingly everything in this season happens. Because Sauron. It's all his grand plan, you see. Skipping ahead now to the end of episode 4, after a short conversation between Elrond and Galadriel, the elves hear drumming banging off in the distance. Shortly after, they are discovered by a group of orcs, one of them gets struck by an arrow, and we get our first glimpse of the healing abilities of the elven Rings of Power. It's not a terrible 1 to 2 minute stretch, but then immediately goes back to shit when Galadriel decides that she has to sacrifice herself, for no reason at all. They could all very easily just slip away quietly before the orcs track them down, but the writers aren't going to allow that to happen because they need the plot to happen. Galadriel gives Elrond the ring, and what follows is another corny action scene that's ended by Adar capturing Galadriel, and the episode ends. So we are now at the point of the story where the Lindon plot now splits into 3. Galadriel has essentially entered the Mordor subplot at this point. Elrond and his company are now on their own, as well as all the stuff happening back in the city with Gil-galad. Now, as to avoid jumping all over the place, I'm mainly going to follow Galadriel for the rest of this section, but I will occasionally jump back to Elrond and Gil-galad as I see fit. So while Galadriel is in Adar's custody, he taunts her and says that he knows that Halbrand is Sauron. This makes absolutely no sense. How on earth would Adar know that Halbrand is Sauron? And when exactly did he make this discovery? It must have happened after he let Halbrand go in episode 1 because he clearly didn't suspect anything then, so what we have here is yet another major plot gap. It's possible that he could have come by this information, but we never see him make this discovery. So essentially, it all must have happened off-screen. Later on, Adar and Galadriel continue their chat, and Adar shows off to Galadriel the power of his army that he intends to invade Eregion with. But then Galadriel pulls out the, "Oh no, you can't do that. This is all part of his master plan. He wants you to attack the city that he's helping forge the Rings of Power in currently." Ah yes, Sauron's master plan. Lure in the army that hates him so he can take it over, even though he already tried and failed miserably trying to do that very thing in the prologue. Got it. So Adar dismisses Galadriel's concerns because obviously that would be a dumb plan on Sauron's part and surely can't be real. The only way that works would be if the show were to decide to write in a massive character retcon for the orcs. But surely the writers wouldn't do that. Oh, wait. Adar blows his big horn, and we are now on the doorstep of one of the most massive battles in history. It's here that the Lindon plotline and the Mordor plotline start to interloop. So I'm going to skip the tactics of the actual battle for now because I'm going to discuss it later in the Mordor section of the video, but instead we'll focus on some of the major things that happen to our characters inside of the Battle of Eregion. So we have now reached the dreaded episode 7, probably the worst episode in the entirety of Rings of Power. Elrond shows up with the army of Lindon, and instead of using using basic militaristic logic and continuing his charge all the way through, he instead decides to have a sit-down with Udar. During this sit-down, Udar offers Elrond Galadriel's life in exchange for the Elven Ring. Elrond rightfully declines because that would be idiotic, and you'd think that would just be the end of it. But no, Udar allows Elrond to give Galadriel one last goodbye, even though he has no reason to grant Elrond this. Elrond gives Galadriel one of the most out-of-place kisses I have ever seen, and very quote-unquote sneakily hands Galadriel a gadget that he took from his cape as a means to free herself. Although this isn't very sneaky at all, cause it's obvious that everybody in that tent is watching this exchange happen, and should obviously notice that Elrond hands something to Galadriel however subtle it may be. But the writers don't allow anybody in the room to possess any sort of sense whatsoever, because they need the plot to happen. So later on, Galadriel escapes from her chains, but now has to try and blend in and successfully maneuver her way through the orc encampment in order to escape. She does okay for a while, but is eventually discovered. Welp, it's all over for you now, Galadriel. Unless... Boom! Arondir spawns in to save her exactly when the plot needs him to. Galadriel thanks Arondir for conveniently saving her, stops him from going on a temper tantrum and killing himself, and then sneaks into Eregion through a secret path that she knows. When she arrives, she sees that Celebrimbor is being seized by soldiers, and stops the soldiers from doing so. Even though Anatar is now the proclaimed Lord of Eregion and the soldiers are seemingly loyal to him, they just go along with Galadriel's orders for them to stand down, even though she shouldn't have any authority over Anatar at this point. Galadriel and Celebrimbor have an exchange of words, in which Celebrimbor gives Galadriel the Rings of Men. And the elven guards overhearing this conversation just decide, you know what? You're right, Celebrimbor. We stand with you. Anatar is Sauron. Even though Celebrimbor tried to convince them earlier and they didn't believe him, so the fact that they believe him now feels completely contrived, especially considering that no new evidence has been presented to convince the guards that yes, Anatar is in fact Sauron. From here, I'm going to skip to the final confrontation between Galadriel and Sauron. I will discuss the events she's involved in leading up to this, but I'll leave it for the Mordor section because a lot of it has tactical implications on the battle at large. So Galadriel is taken to Udar by the orcs and oh shit, he's hot. The Elven Ring made him hot. Careful, Galadriel. We know you have a tendency to fall for very evil, attractive men. The orcs then betray Udar and kill him, which completely breaks the show, but I've already discussed that in detail in part 1, and my god, I do not want to do it again. Which means now it's time for the final battle between Galadriel and Sauron. Now, I'm not going to say that this fight is the worst thing that I've ever seen, but it certainly isn't good, and in fact, it's far from good. First of all, I'm not too knowledgeable on the expanded Tolkien lore, but I find it completely unbelievable that Galadriel would be able to put up this much of a fight against a being like Sauron the way that she does. It's pretty obvious to me that they stretched out this sequence for as many minutes as they can get out of it. If you take a look at the choreography, I will say that this is for sure, in my mind, one of the weakest fight sequences we've seen in the show. There are so many unnecessary spins that leave them extremely exposed, that after like the 7th time it happens, I just find myself asking over and over, why are you spinning? Why are you spinning? Stop spinning. You don't need to spin. Eventually, Sauron finally stops fucking around and brutally stabs her in the heart. She of course survives, however, jumps off the side of a cliff, and the final season-ending duel has come to an end, and has already been forgotten about 5 minutes later. Galadriel somehow survives this immense fall from great heights. The fact that she isn't a big pile of goo after something like that is just completely ridiculous. Elrond then decides to use the Ring of Power to save Galadriel's life, even though he has been characterized this whole season as being vehemently against using the rings. Now, you could argue that this could be seen as character progression, but I'd on the other hand argue that this is more of a character destruction. After Galadriel is healed by the combined power of 2 elven rings, the remaining surviving elves retreat from Eregion to dwell by the river that is said to be safe. Gil-galad holds up his sword to the rest of the elven people in an effort to be symbolic, I guess, and the season finally ends. My god, thank the Lord that it is over. In summary, the Lindon plot is an absolute disaster. It is littered with contrivances, filled with story beats that don't make a shred of sense, numerous amounts of character assassinations, and just an overall bore. While I don't think that the Linden subplot is the worst storyline in Rings of Power, that title would go to Sauron and Celebrimbor due to how damaging it is to the overall narrative. Linden is certainly up there because it also does a great deal of damage to the overarching story. But now that we've covered everything from the Linden side of the story, I'm now going to shift gears and talk about the other side of the conflict, that being the Mordor subplot. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, the Mordor subplot eventually combines with Galadriel's part of the story. So what I'm going to do with this section is I'm going to briefly talk about the first 3 episodes in Mordor before it combines with Galadriel. And from there, I'll skip to episode 7 and discuss the dreaded Battle of Eregion. So, now that we're on the same page, let's get into the Mordor plot, shall we? As we make our way back into the plot of Mordor, we see that Waldreg, I guess, has been promoted to Adar's right-hand man, presumably. I mean, I guess it makes sense. He literally single-handedly created Mordor, and caused the Númenóreans' defeat and retreat back to Númenor. However, there is one major character contradiction that happens with Waldreg once Halbrand reveals that Sauron is still alive. If you remember back to Season 1, Waldreg said that he comes from a long line of devout Sauron worshippers, and wishes to worship Sauron himself. But it seems like the writers just forgot about this character trait because Waldreg seemingly doesn't care that the master he felt destined to serve is alive. The show just artificially rewrites Waldreg as now being a devout worshipper of Adar to a fold. The writing errors here are obvious, but it's also a missed opportunity. It could have added another layer to Waldreg's character in this season outside of just being the welcome to Mordor guy.
Welcome to Mordor!
It could have been interesting to see him try and escape Adar's encampment, so he could go off and worship the true Dark Lord. But instead, the writers just decide to unceremoniously kill him off by having a dog bite off his head. Rest in peace, Waldreg. But anyways, I'm going to skip over the stupidity of Halbrand's plan and negotiations with Adar as to avoid repeating myself because I already talked about it in part 1, so I'll fast forward to episode 3. The orcs are now preparing for their conquest of Eregion when Adar summons Damrod, a giant troll who was a big nothing of a character. Seriously, I don't know why on earth he was included in the story. They hype him up the whole season as if he's going to play a major role in the downfall of Eregion, but he doesn't. He storms the walls, dies in a forgettable fashion, and that's it. All the time spent with him is an absolute waste of time because he doesn't serve any purpose in progressing the story whatsoever. But anyways, sorry I went on a little tangent about Damrod there. The orcs are now on the move towards Eregion when a group of orcs discover Elrond's party in the middle of the forest. Now, I already touched on this scene back in the Linden section, so I'm going to skip ahead as to avoid repeating myself. I'm actually going to skip ahead quite a bit, all the way to episode 7, because mostly everything that happens after this point in the Mordor plot line before we get to episode 7 involves Galadriel, which I discussed earlier. So I promised that for this section, when we got to the Battle of Eregion, that I'd discuss everything wrong with the actual battle itself. And there is a significant amount of things wrong with this battle, and it's pretty easy to see them when you just take a step back and think about what's actually happening for more than 2 seconds. But I quickly want to take an even further step back and shine light on a battle that is often being compared to the one that we see here, that being the Battle of Helm's Deep. On the surface, these two battles are pretty similar. We have a massive orc army trying to scale a massive wall so they can destroy the city behind it. But obviously the Battle of Helm's Deep is significantly better than the Battle of Eregion, but why? Well, besides the fact that the tactics seen in the Battle of Helm's Deep are much more fleshed out and make a whole lot more of sense, Helm's Deep does a much better job of portraying the actual battle that is going on. Before the battle actually takes place, we spend a decent amount of time inside of Helm's Deep, so we're able to get a very good understanding of the fortress itself and the geography surrounding it. So by the time that the orcs come, we know exactly what is going on and where the characters are at any given time. The Battle of Eregion, on the other hand, doesn't do this very well. All we really get to establish the geography surrounding Eregion is the occasional establishing shot of the city, as well as the one shot of a drawn map that Arondir found on an orc that he killed. And because the show doesn't take the time to actually give us a deep understanding of the battleground that this battle will be taking place in, it's very easy to get lost in what exactly is even happening or where exactly the characters are at any given time. And as a result, it's much harder to comprehend the entirety of the battle itself. But now that I've got all the contextual stuff out of the way, what exactly happens in the Battle of Eregion? Well, the orcs start out by besieging the city, launching a ton of boulders with trebuchets in an attempt to weaken the elven defenses. This is pretty standard stuff, but the problem is we have no idea exactly how long this is going on for, as the siege takes place in episodes 6 through 7. I initially assumed that it must have been a few days at tops, but it is entirely unclear. However, after the show concluded, the writers of the show answered this question by saying that the siege went on for weeks, which makes the fact that the elves in all that time didn't bother with launching any sort of counterattack absolute insanity. After weeks of besieging the city, the orc army eventually decides to launch some of their boulders at the nearby mountain, and as a result, the entire mountain comes falling down and dams the river separating the orc army from Eregion. And I know that I've said a lot of things so far have been stupid, but this has to be the stupidest thing I have seen in the entirety of the show. The fact that these rocks are able to bring down the mountain to the scale at which they do shows that the writers officially have lost all their brain cells. That is not how physics works. They would have to be throwing rocks at that mountain for weeks if they ever wanted to bring the whole thing down. But all it takes is a couple of launches. And even if you want to argue, yes, Night Swan, this is definitely possible, okay, you can argue that if you want, but the fact that the falling rocks dam the river so perfectly that the orcs can cross it as if it's just a flat surface is hysterical. This is beyond far-fetched. This is just the writers going with the first thing that comes into their heads without taking any more than 2 seconds to think about the logistics of what they're actually writing. Also, even if they have successfully dammed the river, they shouldn't be able to cross it for a significant amount of time. You want to know why? Because they would sink in the mud. Have you ever tried to walk on land that has been submerged underwater for a significant amount of time? You can't, because the ground is still so damp that it's basically like chunky liquid. It's like trying to walk through quicksand. It's going to very quickly submerge you down to your knees. But once again, like I said, these writers don't take more than 2 seconds to think about the logistics of what they're actually writing. So the orcs begin to advance towards the wall, but they don't have much trouble reaching it because there's nowhere near enough elven archers to repel them. I did a rough count and there's maybe 24 elves that we can actually see shooting back. Are you kidding me? This is the entire strength of Eregion's forces? Remember how in Helm's Deep that the elves and men were shoulder to shoulder with a bunch more to spare on the ground fighting back? That felt realistic. This feels like the editing team ran out of time before they could CGI in more elves. The storming of the wall seemingly goes on for a while until the army of Linden shows up on their flank. The Linden army charges, but then stops right at the last second when the orc army reveals that they have Galadriel in a cage right at the front lines. But the fact that they stop is really stupid considering they're charging at great speed on horses. All you have to do is continue forward for like 2 more seconds and then you'll just run them all over, and then can take back Galadriel. And even if you're worried that they'd have enough time to get in a quick stab on Galadriel, that's not really a concern anymore considering that Elrond is now in possession of one of the Elven Rings of Power that has been shown to be able to heal mortal wounds. But the writers don't allow for this basic militaristic logic, so we can instead have a pointless sit down between the opposing sides as leaders. After the exchange is over and doesn't lead to any resolution, later on the elves chase the orc army back into the forest. But this isn't really the smartest thing to do considering the majority of their army is on horseback, and it is definitely harder to defeat an army on horseback when you're in the forest, and have to outmaneuver all the obstacles in your way, instead of on open land where you can just charge and don't really have to worry about running into anything. During the skirmish, Elrond has a confrontation with an orc, where he kills him. The orc falls into the catapult, and then Elrond launches it for some reason, even though it's directed directly at the very city that he's trying to defend. Meanwhile, a portion of the orc army is still attacking the walls of the city. They have made significant advancements and the ladders are now going up. Welp, you'd think it's over for the elven army now, considering that they only have like 24 archers at their disposal. But nope. The 24 elves are able to successfully push back a massive chunk of the orc army. I don't think I really need to explain why that's stupid, so I will move on. Skip forward to nighttime, and the army of Linden has now come to the aid of the 24 archers in fighting the remaining orcs surrounding the wall. The tide of the battle seems to be on their side, but it's made clear that they have to take down the siege engine because it's about to break through the wall. And what follows is the saddest attempt at a last stand death scene for a background elf that nobody knows the name to, in a pitiful attempt to try and recreate the epic last stand of Boromir from Lord of the Rings. The destruction of the siege engine seems to really give the elves the momentum now. Although I am entirely guessing because it is very unclear who is actually winning, but the orcs have to retaliate in some way, so Adar finally decides to send in Damrod. Now why he waited this long to send Damrod in, instead of just sending him in with the rest of the army from the get-go, is entirely unclear, but the writers probably did this just so they could have their big troll sequence towards the end of the episode. Even even though from a logical perspective it doesn't make much sense why Adar has waited this long to use his biggest weapon, especially considering that it's made very clear earlier in the episode by Glug that the Orc army has been taking heavy losses. But regardless, he is finally sent in. However, after he gets hit with many arrows, gets hit in the tummy really hard, and stabbed a multitude of times by Elrond, Gil-galad, and Arondir, Damrod dies. Yup, he's just dead. They kill him off without having him kill anybody significant or change the course of the battle in any significant way. So his inclusion in this season and the build-up they gave him feels entirely pointless and was just a giant waste of time. So after Damrod is defeated, Adar finally decides to join in on the fight himself and gathers what remaining forces that he has and charges towards the wall. And they're obviously going to win at this point because the elves only have like 30 or 40 remaining soldiers left. During the skirmish, Arondir has a one-on-one face-off with Adar, during which he takes a mortal blow to his vital organs, but somehow survives because of course he does, even though him being able to survive this is completely nonsensical. Adar also defeats Elrond and takes the Elven Ring from him. Now the fact that Elrond would take the Elven Ring into battle when that's one of the things that Adar greatly desires also makes no sense. It's never shown or explicitly stated that wearing or being in possession of an Elven Ring gives you anything like increased strength, increased endurance, or anything else that would enhance one's fighting abilities. So the fact that Elrond brung the ring along with him to the fight instead of just leaving it with someone in the Elven camp that he can trust is just sheer idiocy. And with that, we have finally reached the end of the dreaded episode 7. Oh my god, that was a slog to get through. But we are not done quite yet, because we still have to get through the season finale, Shadow and Flame. So the orcs finally breach the walls and storm Eregion, and attempt to kill whatever elven civilians and soldiers are still within the city walls. The fact that there is anybody left in the city still besides military personnel is just stupid, considering that we later learn that there are multiple hidden ways out of the city that the civilians could have escaped through, and the fact that this siege has been going on for weeks. But eventually, Galadriel decides to lead some of the civilians out of one of the secret entrances. However, a bunch of orcs are waiting for them at the exit. Now, the orcs knowing about this doesn't make any sense because why would they know about it? And the fact that they do also does further damage to the overall narrative, because if they knew about this entrance the entire time, then why wouldn't they utilize it? Why wouldn't they send a big chunk of their forces through it from the get-go, in an attempt to destroy Eregion from the inside out? Meanwhile, however, the orcs begin to raise Eregion, as well as gathering up all of the elven leaders. They also start destroying a bunch of very important stuff, which rightfully pisses the elves off. But right on cue, the dwarves have finally arrived to give the elves the aid that they earlier promised. And just in case you couldn't tell who these people were, Gil-galad is happy to remind us that the little people in armor are in fact dwarves. So thank you, Gil-galad. I was struggling to put 2 and 2 together there. After the dwarves come to the elves' aid, the combined strength of what's left of the elves and the dwarves defeat the remaining orcs in the city. And what happens after this point is entirely unclear. All we get, to my knowledge, is one last shot of Sauron holding Celebrimbor's hammer, and that's it. So I guess we're just going to have to fill in the blanks. Presumably, Sauron has taken whatever orcs remain and retreated back to Mordor, but that is entirely my best guess. We don't know for sure. And that concludes the dreaded Mordor plot. In summary, the Mordor plot, similar to the Lindon plot, is absolutely terrible. The first half of the season in Mordor is pretty scarce for meaningful content and plot points. But when we finally get to what was supposed to be the good stuff, the Battle of Eregion, what we received was one of the most poorly written sequences of fantasy warfare of all time. And that may very well be what Season 2 is remembered for. Years from now, when people look back on the second season, it may very well be dumbed down to, oh yeah, that was the season with the really stupid battle in it. And as sad as that is to say, that's just the reality. But thank God it is over for now. And with that, I'm gonna cut it off here for part 2. Welcome everybody to part 3 of Why the Rings of Power Sucks. Today, we are going to be taking an in-depth look at the Pelagir subplot as well as the Khazad-dûm subplot. If you haven't seen part 1 or part 2 and would like to watch either of those before watching this one, then the link to those videos will be in the description. However, you don't have to watch the first 2 parts in order to understand part 3, so if you'd like to just watch this one first and then cycle back to the first 2 afterwards, that's totally fine as well. But without wasting any more time, let's get started, shall we? We'll start with the Pelagir subplot first and then transition to the Khazad-dûm plot afterwards. So the Pelagir plotline starts with Beric the horse going off to save Isildur from the Black Forest. In doing so, he overcomes many orcs and giant spiders to save this man, making him one of the best and most heroic characters in the whole show. Yeah, you heard me right. A horse is one of the best characters in Rings of Power, and I will stand by that claim in all seriousness. Isildur and Beric make their way through the desolate waste of what was once the Southlands, until Isildur passes by a carriage and gets stabbed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our first introduction to the newest insufferable bitch of the show, Estrid. She might even give Galadriel a run for her money as my most despised character of Rings of Power. But anyways, Estrid stabs Isildur because she believed him to be an orc, which is just beyond stupidity. There is no logical reason for Estrid to believe that Isildur was in fact an orc. Orcs and men look nothing alike. Isildur isn't wearing any orc-like armor of any kind, and orcs are famous for their animal-like noises and grunts that they make, all of which Isildur does none of as he approaches the carriage. Isildur should be very angry at Estrid for doing something so stupid, and he is admittedly at first, but brushes it off very quickly after he presumably deems Estrid attractive, thus kicking off the beginnings of one of the dumbest subplot romances in modern fiction. Isildur decides to take Estrid with him, despite him having no reason to do so, especially after what she did, but he does so anyway. They make their way to the old Númenórean settlement of Pelagir after Isildur deems that that is the most likely place in which Elendil led the survivors of the eruption of Mount Doom. But they run into a little bit of trouble along the way, but don't worry, here comes Arondir. God, this guy really just spawns in anywhere whenever the plot needs him to. And I find this scene so funny because Arondir literally just flips on in, kills a bunch of dudes, saves Isildur and Estrid, and then just leaves. It's literally just, oh, here I come, let's kill a bunch of people, okay, looks like everybody's dead, well, see ya, the plot no longer needs me. Like, what? Where are you going? This whole sequence is just bizarre in the way that it's written. But anyways, Isildur and Estrid follow Arondir back to Pelagir since they're all going to go to the same place. And this is where the Pelagir subplot splits off in a bunch of different directions. And there are times where they overlap each other. So for now I'm going to follow Arondir, but I'll switch back and forth as I see fit based on how the story unfolds. So Arondir tries to pick up the pieces of his and Theo's relationship after the death of Bronwyn back in Season 1. Theo hates Arondir, however, and basically tells him to fuck off, and that he doesn't really want to see him anymore. Now, I don't know why Theo is so hostile towards Arondir. He doesn't really have any reason to. But the show feels like it just has to artificially add a sense of tension between these two characters, even though logically it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The show tries to make the point that Theo hates Arondir because he isn't his real father, and he presumably was trying to act like his father ever since his relationship with Bronwyn blossomed. But this hatred feels very contrived considering how good of a partner and protector Arondir was for Theo and Bronwyn, and how nice he has been towards Theo. But since Bronwyn is dead, Theo comes to the irrational conclusion, welp, you're dead to me now. Go away, elf. And that's exactly what Arondir does, for the time being. We then cut to Theo chatting with Isildur. Theo tells Isildur he knows where Beric is after he ran off, and Isildur would obviously want to know where Beric is. But Theo pulls out the classic, no, come back at midnight, only then will I tell you. So we have to wait until midnight for reasons unknown. Theo then leads Isildur out into the woods, where Beric is being held hostage by a group of wild men. And here we have a pretty major plot gap. We never saw Theo discover where Beric actually was or how he knows that this specific horse belongs to Isildur. Now this all could have happened off screen, but once again, this whole sequence is all contrived in an effort to move the plot forward. While Isildur is trying to free Beric, Theo then reveals himself to the group of wild men for no reason whatsoever. What he hopes to gain by this is unclear. But a fight breaks out, Isildur escapes with Beric, and Theo is kidnapped by a tree. Welp, that sucks, Theo. Guess you're just gonna have to wait for good old Arondir to save you. And that's exactly what happens. Skip forward to episode 4, and Arondir starts leading the search for Theo. But before that, we are subjected to this awful cringe fest of a scene, as well as Estrid getting discovered for being a liar by Arondir. Thank God, it is about time someone realized that this girl was sketch, because apparently Isildur couldn't. We then jump to the three of them venturing off to find Theo, because Arondir believes that Estrid will know where Theo is. And they quickly find themselves in a new sticky situation, or should I say, muddy situation. And what follows is probably the most pointless scene in the whole episode. This whole sequence of Isildur and Arondir accomplishes absolutely nothing and doesn't progress the story in any meaningful way. All it does is just burn time. The only reason I can come up with for why it was included is because the writers probably felt it had been too long without some type of action, and they also want to convince the audience to trust Estrid again. But if that's really what you wanted to do, there are much better ways that you could have done that instead of just having Estrid put a stick in the mud in a hopeless attempt to fish them out. She better be thanking that worm thing, cause there's no way she actually thought that this was going to work. Arondir then gives Estrid the key to undo her shackles, which doesn't make any sense because Estrid has not proven herself trustworthy. Even if you want to say that Estrid's stick in the mud plan was her trying to save them, and that makes her trustworthy now, Arondir didn't see that because he was inside the belly of a giant mudworm. And now, presumably, since Arondir is giving Estrid the key, he must trust that her story was real, even though she hasn't proven herself as a trustworthy person. Ultimately though, Isildur is the one that helps use the key to undo Estrid's shackles. And hey, what do you know, I was right. But wait. Estrid's screwed now, unless a bunch of trees show up at exactly the right time. And what follows is a bunch of trees showing up at exactly the right time. The tree stomps in angrily and slaps Estrid with all its might into a rock. Wow, out of all the ways I thought Estrid would have died, I was not expecting that. Wait. She's alive? Are you kidding me? Are you really trying to tell me that the human female survives getting bitch slapped by a tree and goes flying into a rock 50 miles an hour? Yeah, my ass she's alive, but that's the power of plot armor, ladies and gentlemen. Arondir then has a chat with the trees, and after the trees give a bunch of exposition and Arondir calms the crazy tree down, the trees give back Theo. Two things of note happen here. For one, Arondir promises the trees that he's going to help protect the forest, a plot point that the show just seems to forget later in the season. And Theo finally comes around to respecting Arondir. A character arc on the surface I would think is mostly functional, but isn't really that functional when you take into consideration that Theo's starting point as a character, which was hating Arondir, felt very contrived. Meanwhile, here comes Hagen, and the beginning of our love triangle. While this love triangle is definitely really bad, I'm almost hesitant to even call it a love triangle, because as we'll later see, Hagen doesn't really put up any type of a fight, and the only reason that Estrid stays in the end is because Isildur wasn't able to bribe her on the ship. But I'll discuss that more when we get to it. So after this whole clusterfuck of a sequence, Arondir decides to leave Pelagir and run across the entire continent so he can join in when we get to the Battle of Eregion. So he has effectively at this point left the Pelagir plotline, so for what's left of this subplot, we can mainly now shift our focus solely towards Isildur, Estrid, and Theo. So from here, the show barely spends any more time in Pelagir, and we now have to jump all the way to halfway through episode 8 until the show finally decides to return here. So Estrid walks in on Isildur to have an exchange where she finally lays out her feelings towards him. During the exchange, she mentions that Hagen, her betrothed, has started the construction of a home for the two of them, and asks the gods to keep their love strong as long as the home stood. But Estrid doesn't care, and says in fact that she felt sick when he said that, and then says to Isildur that she wants to be with him, further solidifying that Estrid is an awful human being. And the writers try to play this off like it's romance, but it's not. They clearly have no understanding of what romance actually is. After cringing for a minute straight, we now have the arrival of Kemen from Numenor, and he has come to establish Pelagir as a military base for reasons unknown. Right when he arrives, Hagen tells Kemen to listen to Theo because he's the Lord of Pelagir, and he is the son of Bronwyn. And for some reason, they write it in a way in which Kemen actually knows who Theo is. Except there's no reason that he should know any of these people, considering that he's never been to Middle-earth since the beginning of this show, and has never met any of these people. Kemen then discovers that Isildur is alive, but after Isildur tries to bribe Estrid onto the ship back to Numenor, Kemen's like, "Oh no, she's a low man. You can't bring a low man on the ship, and if you disagree with me, I'll slaughter your horse." Oh my god. We'll get to Kemen eventually when I tackle the Numenor subplot, but the fact that they've chosen to characterize Kemen this season as the pure embodiment of evil is not only laughable, but also one of the worst attempts at writing a villain I have ever seen in my life. The last plot point that we see from Pelagir is Isildur sailing off back to Numenor, and Estrid looks upon him leaving and seems to be very sad. And that's it. That's the end of Pelagir. In summary, the Pelagir subplot is terrible, and an absolute waste of time. While Pelagir doesn't necessarily feel the most disconnected from the show and the overall narrative, that title goes to the Runes subplot, I actually think that it was the most worthless. The only reason that the Pelagir subplot exists is because there are a bunch of loose story ends and characters from Season 1 that weren't really tied up very well, so the show has to just figure out something to do with them, because writing them out of the show entirely would feel extremely odd. Pelagir really just sums up to a bunch of characters running around doing shit in the woods, and it doesn't accomplish anything of real significance to the overall story at large. So, with all that said, that's it for Pelagir. Let's move on to the Khazad-dûm subplot, which has a lot more meat to it and overall significance to the story at large. So, we pick up back in the Khazad-dûm plotline at the beginning of episode 2. Prince Durin has been banished by his father, so he and Diza are now being forced to scrape by to survive. Diza is able to sense something bad is about to happen, so she tells everyone to brace themselves. And what follows is an earthquake inside of the mountain, resulting in multiple large boulders falling. The earthquake also causes the sun shafts to collapse, rendering the dwarves unable to grow new crops. Because of this, Diza decides to go see the king. However, the fact that King Durin allows Diza to have an audience with him is unclear, considering that King Durin and the prince aren't on speaking terms and Diza is Prince Durin's wife. The only logical assumption that can be made is because she is a stone singer, she is allowed entrance. But, considering that there are multiple other stone singers, the fact that she was allowed in or summoned still doesn't make perfect sense. Diza fails in her singing attempt, which forces Narvi to begin digging without an identified safe path to dig. The king and Diza then have a brief conversation about the feud between himself and Prince Durin. It's mostly a functional conversation, so I don't really have any complaints here. However, we then cut to Prince Durin in the mines, and there is so much wrong here in such a short scene. After struggling to finish his mining work, which already seems a little bit out of character because Durin has been shown throughout the series to be a very capable dwarf when it comes to hands-on physical laborious activity, he's then verbally heckled and bullied by some nearby dwarves. The fact that these dwarves don't have an immense amount of respect for him, regardless of whether or not the king stripped him of his title, I found pretty unbelievable. He makes some threatening remarks back, but when he is shoved to the ground, he just takes it. He does nothing. This completely goes against how Durin has been characterized this whole show. The disrespect I already had issues with, but Durin not fighting back, acting like some pacifist, just pissed me off. The writers definitely wrote this as a means of making Durin's situation sympathetic, but they clearly did not take into account at all that it does not align in the slightest with how he has been characterized. If you really wanted to show Durin in a vulnerable situation, this is not the way you should have gone about it. Episode 2 finishes in the Khazad-dûm section with a conversation between Diza and Prince Durin. Now this is a scene with things that I like as well as things I don't. On one hand, Diza has once again been shown to be capable of appealing to someone's desires for the sake of the common good. She does that here with Prince Durin the same way that she did earlier with King Durin. Honestly, Diza's characterization this episode has been overall pretty strong, so I will absolutely give credit where credit is due. But on the other hand, however, Diza leverages Prince Durin by feeding him year-old bread. When Prince Durin asks her, "What the fuck is this?" she explains that the king won't let the dwarves go to the surface to harvest crops, and that he has to put aside his differences with him and get through to him. Now, the fact that the king doesn't let his people go to the surface in order to harvest food or trade food would imply that the king does not care about his people. But it has never been characterized this whole show that that's the type of king that Durin is. So once again, we have yet another major character contradiction, this time for King Durin. Skip forward to episode 3, and Prince Durin and Diza are summoned to a Region by Celebrimbor. He tells them that they have crafted rings of power for them, rings with the power to heal their mountain. Now, I already mentioned it back in part 1, but the fact that Anatar even knew about the recent development to tell Celebrimbor, when it's been stated that King Durin hasn't let any dwarves up to the surface, makes absolutely no sense, and it is a pretty severe plot hole. Prince Durin is hesitant to bring the offer back to King Durin because they are no longer on speaking terms. However, Anatar persuades him by using information that he couldn't possibly know about. Celebrimbor allows the dwarves time to think it over, even though Anatar doesn't want to give them that time. This whole conversation conversation, Sauron, or Anatar, has acted very suspicious, to say the least, and Durin is rightly skeptical. However, Diza is not. She pretty much just blindly goes along with it because she believes that this could possibly be the last hope of restoring their mountain because no other solutions have presented themselves. Diza tells Prince Durin that he's got to dwarf up and take this information to the king, or else she will. We cut to a bunch of merchants outside of King Durin's throne room begging for food. The fact that the king still to this point hasn't allowed for any trade just further deepens the fact that he seemingly doesn't care about his people. And in comes Prince Durin to finally reconcile with his father. Prince Durin lays out the nature of Celebrimbor's offer to the king, and adds that he does not trust the power that is being forged for them in Eregion. Now the prince did not have to come and tell the king this offer, for one, because he didn't trust it, and two, because they weren't even on speaking terms. But we can seemingly come to the conclusion that he's done this because he trusts the judgment of his king, and felt like it was his duty to make the decision of this offer for the kingdom. Now, on the surface, I wouldn't have a problem with this. But the issues arise when you consider the fact that Durin's mindset about altering the fates of beings in Middle-earth has changed from Season 1 to Season 2, off-screen. In Season 1, Prince Durin betrayed his father by supplying the elves with mithril as a means to save themselves, despite the king ordering against it, believing that the elves' fate in Middle-earth would ultimately be decided by the Valar. But in Season 2, Prince Durin has seemingly flip-flopped, now believing that they shouldn't use the power to save themselves because it could be altering a fate that was predetermined for them by higher beings. So, as you now see, this is yet another major character contradiction and inconsistency for Prince Durin. Skip forward to the end of the episode. King and Prince Durin, as well as Diza, are in attendance for the finishing of the forging of the Dwarven Rings. Now, obviously considering that they're already here, the decision by King Durin to accept the offer from Celebrimbor happened off-screen. You'd think that would be a vital piece of not only plot, but also characterization for the king, but it's just completely glossed over. It's especially a missed opportunity for some character back and forth between the king and the prince, considering that the king has gone against the prince's recommendations that they not take the offer. But instead, this short scene solely serves as a cliffhanger for episode 4, ending episode 3. In fact, we actually have to skip forward to episode 5 until we return back to Khazad-dûm. So King Durin, for the time being, is now in possession of all 7 of the Dwarven Rings of Power, but this is the one in particular that he chooses to wear. Immediately, King Durin starts to fundamentally change as a person, eventually becoming insane within the span of a few days or weeks, as we see later in the season. Now, this particular aspect of the show I take extreme issue with, but I already discussed it back in part 1, so I'll skip over it for now. King Durin is escorted down to one of the tunnels that the dwarves are currently digging in an attempt to find the light. They seemingly haven't made much progress, but King Durin very quickly points out a spot for them to dig due to the powers of the ring. Now, why this ring gives him this particular power is never explained, which is another issue in of itself. So King Durin starts to dig in the spot that he pointed out, despite the wall being a foundation wall. Foundation meaning that the entire structural integrity of the tunnel depends on the wall not being damaged. But despite this fact, Durin decides to dig, putting not only himself but the lives of many others at risk. So we logically have to assume that he's doing this because he has put full faith in the Ring of Power, despite him never actually using it before. He has no idea whether this ring is going to do the things that he thinks it can do. And this goes against how King Durin has been earlier characterized, that being a cautious person. Now, you could chalk this all up to he's acting out of character because of the ring, but then that just cycles back to my original issue with the ring fundamentally changing who he is as a person in such a short amount of time. But anyways, the mountain is seemingly healed in a matter of minutes. There's no real nuance or struggle to the situation. They're just able to quickly and easily overcome the problem that they've been dealing with for half a season. I'm not going to say that it isn't possible, I just wish it was more fleshed out than it was. It's very glossed over. A short time later, Diza buys a gemstone for presumably her daughter's birthday. However, the stone is extremely expensive due to the king imposing a 100% tax on all goods. The greed of the king has reached insane levels in such a short amount of time. So much so that he would financially bankrupt his people, just so he can add a few more coins to his riches. Also, this tax would utterly destroy their economy, but I guess he's just too stupid to realize that. Diza drops the stone, and it rolls off into the distance, down a dark cave. Diza tries to retrieve it while looking like a bumbling idiot. And of course, the stone makes its way right to this very specific spot, despite the odds of it making here so perfectly are next to impossible. But the reason the writers did this was so that they could insert yet another reminder that yes, remember that there is in fact a Balrog down here, something that will become relevant very shortly. Meanwhile, King Doran has summoned representatives from the other dwarven kingdoms to tell them about the Rings of Power. Now this is the first time that anybody from any of the other dwarven kingdoms has been depicted on screen, and they get a total of 0 lines of dialogue. It would be interesting to know their perspectives on these matters, but the writers don't care to depict it. King Doran says that in order for the other dwarven masters to receive their Rings of Power, it will come at a cost. Presumably, that cost will be in the form of gold. The fact that Durin is charging for possession of these other 6 rings when they're not even for him is stupid, but remember, King Durin is greedy now, guys. It's also completely glossed over, but King Durin is likely assuming that the other dwarf lords are in a specific need of these Rings of Power, but why? Are the other dwarven kingdoms in a state of desperation similar to how Khazad-dûm was? Or do they just want power for power's sake? Don't know, the show doesn't care to answer. We then cut to King Durin and Narvi discussing digging deeper in the mountain. Narvi advises against it, but King Durin decides that yes, we are going to continue digging, even though it breaks the mining laws that I put in place decades ago. You want to know why? Remember, he's greedy now, guys. There's literally no nuance whatsoever. He's just made a complete 180 as a character. Prince Durin then enters the room, advising the king himself not to keep digging, because Disa has heard something evil lurking deep in the mountain from earlier in the episode, and that digging deeper could mean awakening it and wreaking havoc. But King Durin doesn't take more than 2 seconds to consider this warning, because he wants money. This also probably would have been a good time for Prince Durin to once again bring up his suspicions of Anatar and his suspicions of the rings, but he doesn't. We then get a short scene of Prince Durin seeking out Celebrimbor to ask him what the fuck is wrong with the rings. Celebrimbor assures him that there is no fault in the rings because they use the exact same process for the dwarven rings as they did with the elven rings. Prince Durin once again raises his suspicions of Anatar. That's really the only purpose of this scene. It's a means for Celebrimbor to develop suspicions of Anatar for himself. Something that should have happened far earlier, but at least the writers are finally trying. But this doesn't really amount to much because once Celebrimbor confronts Anatar about the faults of the dwarven rings, he's just able to easily manipulate him again. So we are once again in a state of Celebrimbor being Anatar's stupid little puppet. Prince Durin then tries to convince the king of the devilry inside of the rings, but he backs off when his father decides to give him back the title of prince, and that seemingly wins him over for the time being. What? Durin, what are you doing? Your princeship doesn't matter in this situation. You are all going to die if your father continues to dig. That should be your only priority. You have to convince your father at all costs that if you continue to dig, that you'll inevitably wake up the giant devil monster. And then he has the balls to go back to Disa and say, "Sorry honey, I tried." Fuck no you didn't. Your passive attitude and inability to truly put your foot down on your father's actions could be the possible destruction of your kingdom. But anyway, later on, Anatar has come to speak with King and Prince Durin in person. Although, why the prince is in attendance doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's said that Anatar summoned him to the king's chamber personally, although why I don't really know, considering that he's come to speak with the king. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense on his part, considering that surely by this point, Anatar should be well aware of the fact that Prince Durin doesn't like him. So his presence in the room will only make it more difficult for him to achieve what he is trying to achieve from his conversation with the king. The only reason the prince is here is because the writers want him to be in attendance to bear witness to the conversation, despite it not making a shred of sense. Anatar tells the king that they are in desperate need of more mithril because Eregion is at risk of invasion, and they want to finish their Rings of Power before that happens. King Durin declines, sends Anatar on his way, and it's not exactly clear why he has done this until about a minute later, where he explains to Prince Durin that whoever controls the mithril will be able to control the wars that are seemingly on the horizon of Middle-earth. So now, not only does King Durin want to be super fucking rich, he also seemingly wants world domination in some form, presumably in the form of the trade market. He wants full control over the most valuable resource in Middle-earth, despite the fact that withholding some of it could mean the death of the elves in Eregion, the same elves that forged for him the ring that saved his kingdom, a ring that he now loves so much. Prince Durin and Diza then come up with a plan. Diza says that they will put their bodies in front of that mine in order to stop the king. The prince replies that that will either mean their death or arrest, but Diza replies to that by saying it will mean showing the people that the king is no longer fit to rule. That would imply that they believe that them getting arrested would result in a revolution against the king. Although it's never really made clear by the show that that would be guaranteed to be the case because we never get any glimpses into how the common dwarf feels about the current state of the kingdom. Skip to episode 7. King Durin is informed by Narvi that Eregion is under siege. But instead of really addressing that situation at all, the king replies with,
"Come on, Narvi, what the fuck are you doing? Get back control of that mine. Every second you waste costs me money. Money, money, money."
When Narvi and the other dwarf guards return to the mine, Prince Durin and Diza stand armed and ready to defend it. At this point, Narvi just decides, you know what, I'm done with this shit. The king is crazy, I stand with you. Now, I don't take issue with Narvi making this decision. After all, any sane person would. What I do take issue with is how easily we get from point A to point B. There is no intense conversation to convince Narvi to make this decision. There's no physical altercation. No, he just decides out of thin air that this is what he's going to do. It's just very vanilla character writing. Narvi then informs the prince that Elrond has come to see him. Durin and Elrond then proceed to have a brief exchange, where they both get on the same page of the current state of things. Elrond tells Durin that he needs his help in aiding the elves in the Battle of Eregion. But before anything else meaningful is discussed, the show just cuts away. By the way, that's a really bad habit that Rings of Power is littered with. We'll be in the middle of a really important scene, but it will just cut away in the middle of it, before it's allowed to properly finish, and it's really annoying. We then cut to Prince Durin's speech, and by the time we get to the speech, we are forced to assume a couple things that must have happened off-screen. For one, Durin deciding to accept Elrond's plea for help happened off-screen. And also, Durin has somehow rallied hundreds and hundreds of dwarves, an army the size capable of giving aid to Eregion, all without the king noticing. Or does he know? Did Prince Durin overthrow the king off-screen and now he controls the will of the people? Or are just enough people fed up with the king that they are willing to follow the prince now? We of course do not get an answer to this. The army assembles at the west gate, and right as Prince Durin and the army are about to leave for Eregion, Narvi comes rushing in to tell him that the king has turned his axe on him and his men. He says the king is intent on continuing the dig, all by himself, all the way to the Balrog, and that Prince Durin must recall the army. Now, considering the situation, and considering that King Durin is likely a more powerful force with the Ring of Power at his hand, it might make sense to recall a small fraction of the army to make sure that the king doesn't unleash the Balrog. But recalling the entire army doesn't make a shred of sense. Someone else besides the prince could very easily lead the remaining 80 to 85% of the army to Eregion, but they forego this basic common sense because the writers need the plot to happen. Skip forward to the beginning of episode 8, and Prince Durin confronts the king. He confronts him one-on-one, however, so clearly he did not need to recall the entire army. The two have a brief exchange of dialogue, which admittedly isn't terrible, before King Durin is able to break through the wall. Keep in mind that the king has managed to dig all the way to the Mithril entirely by himself, which I find to be a stretch at best. King Durin then shows off the riches of the Mithril on the mountain to the prince, but before they really have much of a chance to soak it all in, the Balrog shows up with the intent on killing them. Welp, I guess it took the big fire demon showing up right in front of him before the king realized that he fucked up. Prince Durin fends off an attack from the Balrog, which sends him flying into the rocks. The force of that blow probably should have killed him, but the prince has plot armor, so he survives. The two then have a brief moment to say their goodbyes before the king sacrifices himself in something that looks straight out of a Mario game. Also, before the king sacrifices himself, he takes off the Ring of Power, and clearly, judging by the shot, the prince does not have enough time to retrieve it, so the ring is presumably lost. However, there is a shot later in the episode where we see that the ring was in fact retrieved, but how exactly? Your guess is as good as mine. The scene ends with the tunnel collapsing, seemingly sealing off the Balrog's entry into the rest of the mountain. Skip forward to the end of the episode, and Prince Durin, now soon to be King Durin IV, receives news from Narvi of the status of Eregion. He is told that Eregion has fallen, and Elrond has helped lead the survivors off to somewhere. But before Durin is able to order aid to the survivors, Narvi and Diza are quick to tell him that he has more pressing matters to deal with. Apparently, Durin has a brother. I guess he was mentioned once across the entirety of the past 2 seasons, but apparently this brother is advancing claims for the throne. So, stay tuned for season 3, I guess. Ugh, Jesus Christ. And with that, the Khazad-dûm plot has reached its end for season 2. In summary, the Khazad-dûm plot, similar to every other plot in the show, is not good. I will go as far to say that it is probably the best plotline in Season 2, but saying that it's the best plotline in a show like Rings of Power isn't much of a compliment at all. Khazad-dûm sadly suffers mostly from terrible character writing and character inconsistencies which can't be overlooked. Some of them are egregious enough to break the story. Even though the Khazad-dûm plot was also bad in Season 1, at least after that season's conclusion, we were left with some somewhat functional characters. However, Season 2 has actively broken every single one of them, so any interest that I may have had for the storyline has been completely thrown out the window. It's a shame because with better writing, the Khazad-dûm plot could have very well been salvaged, but instead, it has been sunk deep into the ground. And with all that said, I'm going to cut it off here for Part 3.
Oh my god, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
Invited this man.
Get your ass on, boy. You get your goddamn...
Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 4 of Why the Rings of Power Season 2 Sucks. This will be the final part of the series, and we're almost finished. But there is still a great deal of bullshit to unpack. If you haven't seen any of the prior 3 parts and would like to watch those before watching this one, then you can find the link to those videos in the description. However, you don't have to watch any of the first 3 parts in order to understand Part 4, so if you'd like to just watch this one first and then cycle back to the first 3 afterwards, then that's totally fine as well. Today, we are going to be dissecting the final 2 subplots remaining in Rings of Power Season 2. That being the Rune subplot as well as the Numenor subplot. We'll start with Rune and then transition into Numenor afterwards. So, to kick off the Rune subplot, we start off with Nori and not Gandalf making their way through the desert waste. They seemingly don't know which way they are going, and Nori is quick to bring up the fact that they are lost. Well, of course you guys are lost. You have been following stars, which only appear at night, which will make it harder to stay on the path towards your destination during the day, because you cannot see the stars during the day. Now, granted, stars obviously don't move a significant amount in the sky from night to night, so if you have a general idea of the direction you are supposed to go, then you should be fine. But if you find yourself going through a landscape where you are constantly being turned around in different directions, then it's going to be harder to keep straight which direction you're actually supposed to be headed in. Shortly after, Nori says that they are out of food. Now, this shouldn't be a problem considering, as we saw back in Season 1, that not Gandalf was able to create a bunch of food out of nothing for the Harfoots. But for some reason, he's hesitant to do so here, so Nori has to beg him in order for not Gandalf to finally agree to make food. He kinda fucks up though, explodes the nearest tree, but luckily a bunch of bugs come crawling out, so I guess they can eat those. In fact, Nori is ecstatic at the fact that they get to eat bugs. Yeah, this girl definitely looks like a bug eater. Later that night, Nori and Gandalf are eating their bugs by the fire. Gandalf expresses that he is upset with himself because he wasn't able to control his power, and Nori responds to that by saying, "Alright, well, then just learn to control your powers." Yeah, thanks Nori. How helpful that is. Nori, in response to Gandalf opening up, expresses that she misses her home. Now, this line is a little confusing to me and falls flat because Harfoots don't have a home. They are constantly moving around. Now, when she says home, it's possible you could interpret that as meaning her family and her community of Harfoots around her, but that is never specified and seemingly isn't what she is talking about specifically. So I'm going to assume that she's talking about home as if it's a place. And because she is talking about a place, this seems very out of character for not only herself, but also just a Harfoot in general. So Gandalf and Nori suspect that skeleton mask dude is following them. So the next day, they conduct a trap to capture him. Despite this being one of the most obvious traps in history, only a total idiot would fall for this. Checks out. Wait, Poppy, how the fuck are you here? Did you just spawn in out of nowhere? I have so many questions that I know I will never get the answer to. So since Poppy is now somehow here, the show has inadvertently established that Poppy is an incredible tracker. In fact, probably one of the best trackers in the world. Gandalf and Nori left Poppy behind last season, so if she was going to leave the pack and seek them out, Gandalf and Nori would have had a significant head start and have been well out of sight. So Poppy would have obviously had to have tracked them somehow. Then there's the 2 other questions. Did she just finally catch up to them and finally track them down? Or was she just waiting around watching them until the writers could write in a contrived dramatic entrance for her? Who knows? I guess we're just going to have to go with it. So since the three of them don't have any maps and aren't able to effectively navigate the desert, Poppy conveniently pulls out a piece of paper with some writing on it, saying that as long as they sing their walking song, they'll be able to find the way to the place they want to go. This is really goofy in my opinion, but regardless, they skip and sing their way through the desert and make it to the lands of Rune. Later on, Skeleton Masked Man returns to the Dark Wizard. Inside Dark Wizard's sandcastle, he and his minions perform some magic and resurrect this chick from the dead. If you don't remember who this chick, who is called the Dweller, even is, then I can't blame you because last season she was so entirely useless. Dark Wizard asks the Dweller what she knows. She repeats things that we already know. Dark Wizard gets mad and threatens to replace her. Skeleton Man walks in and says that he's found the wizard and the Harfoots. Dark Wizard wants to capture Not Gandalf soon before he can grow too powerful and become a threat to himself. So Skeleton Man says that he's up for the task, and when Dark Wizard is rightfully skeptical of his abilities to get the job done, he responds by saying that he'll capture the Harfoots first so Not Gandalf is forced to surrender. Easier said than done. How he plans to accomplish this, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Cut back to the desert. The three idiots continue to march on while spewing meaningless dialogue. The three are sitting when Gandalf hears the steps of horses approaching from the distance. Poppy and Nori are so quick to hide themselves that before Not Gandalf can even turn around, they are already fully hidden, and Not Gandalf is stranded alone. Now this is in character for the Harfoots, that they would be able to hide themselves effectively since that has been established earlier in the series. But at the same time, it's a pretty dick move by them, cause they're pretty much just screwing over Not Gandalf. And now he's just gotta hope that he can find a hiding spot, but hey, every man for themselves, I guess. The three are able to successfully hide themselves, and after the skeleton people leave, Not Gandalf deduces the fact that they are still being followed. And because of this, they are going to have to change their course. Now, Not Gandalf is right. Yes, they are being tracked. But what Not Gandalf fails to realize is how does he think they were tracked in the first place? And how would changing your path change anything besides slowing them down? Surely you have to realize that they were able to track you, presumably in large part because of the trail you've left behind with your feet. And it doesn't matter if you change paths. That's still going to leave a trackable trail. And Not Gandalf doesn't mention anything about covering up their trail or masking their trail, so I am led to believe that he is entirely naive enough to believe that this is a good plan. And it inevitably is not a good plan, because next time we see them, they are struggling their way through the desert. Not Gandalf collapses of dehydration, but conveniently, there is just a well that happens to be over the next hill, because of course there is. After Not Gandalf gets resuscitated, the skeleton people are able to track them down thanks to the very convenient bell that went off when the well was used. As the skeleton people charge, their first action is to shoot arrows at them. Keep in mind that the Dark Wizard specifically stated that he wanted them alive, so them doing this is beyond stupidity. Gandalf picks up a nearby stick, uses it as a staff, and just summons a sand tornado. He still has very little control over his powers, however, so he is entirely unable to control it, which sends everybody besides himself flying hundreds of feet into the air after being sucked into the vortex, effectively killing them all. But nope, none of them die, as we'll see later. You have to remember, guys, Rings of Power is a very stupid show. Anybody with 2 brain cells would understand that getting flinged hundreds of feet into the air at great speed is going to kill somebody when they land. But sadly, the writers of the show don't have 2 brain cells, so everybody survives without a scratch. Skip forward to episode 4. Not Gandalf goes off to search for Nori and Poppy, even though they should be dead due to the laws of physics. He stumbles upon a house in the middle of the desert and asks this guy whether he has seen them. He responds with some confusing dialogue, but it pretty much translates to, "I don't care." Gandalf then loses his map because of a gust of wind. It somehow very conveniently travels all the way to this specific tree, and this specific tree decides to eat him. Why does the tree eat him? Who knows? Meanwhile, Nori and Poppy wake up from their slumber, although, as you all know, they should be dead. The skeleton people have already been able to find them, causing the two to run away frantically. They run into this bumbling idiot named Miramak, who, of course, is the means to lead them to a secret village where they will be safe. So basically, the writers had to have them land very conveniently ever so close to a new character who can lead them to safety from the skeleton people that have been chasing them the entire season so far. And the writers do this because they somehow couldn't find a logical way to get from point A to point B. So they just said fuck it and took a shortcut. Miramac takes them to the super hidden village, which we'll find out later in the series isn't super well hidden. We then get our first introduction to Gundabale, who is immediately characterized as being an asshole.
Are you talking backsass to me?
When Gundabale threatens to kick them out, and has them plead as to why they should stay, Nori says that they have walked across the earth in order to help their wizard friend find his destiny. Gundabale then jumps to the conclusion that they must be working for the Dark Wizard since she said the word wizard. And her jumping to this conclusion I think makes no sense. For one, she talks about the Dark Wizard as if he is the only wizard in the world, and for all she may know, there may just happen to be multiple wizards across the world. So why is she just assuming that there can only be one wizard? 2. Nori says that they have traveled across the earth with this wizard, implying that they have come from great distances. And as we've seen up to this point, the Dark Wizard seems to just sit on his throne not doing anything. And he's not too far away since his sandcastle is also located in Rune. So, judging based on the actual words that Nori says, Gundabale should be able to deduce that this is a different wizard that she is talking about. And 3. Assuming all you presumably know about this Dark Wizard, do you really think that these two gremlins of all people are in cahoots with the Dark Wizard? Come on. The fact that she jumps to this conclusion is one of the worst contrivances in the show. Back in Dark Wizard's sandcastle, Skeleton Man has returned to inform Dark Wizard of their current failings. Dark Wizard tells Skeleton Man from now on to only focus on capturing the Harfoots, and that he will take care of the E-Star himself. So after half the season being already over, the Dark Wizard has finally decided that he is going to get up and do something. Cut back to not Gandalf. Tom Bombadil comes to fish not Gandalf out of the tree. The fact that he knew to look here would imply that this has happened before, so it was kind of a dick move by Tom to not warn not Gandalf to watch out for the eating tree, since his map was flying in that direction. Back at Tom Bombadil's house, him and not Gandalf have a lot of back and forth dialogue. A lot of it could have been cut since it provides no additional value, but regardless, the key takeaways are, Tom Bombadil is the oldest being in Middle-earth, he trained the Dark Wizard to use magic, and that it's Gandalf's destiny to face off against the Dark Wizard and Sauron. Well, we know one of those is a complete lie, because Gandalf never did directly face off against Sauron, at least in his full form. And the face-off against the Dark Wizard later down the line, I know is going to be goofy as hell. Back in the Store Village, Nori, Poppy, and Miramac have been tied up. Nori reveals to Gundabale that her tribe leader was Sedek, and since Gundabale knows who that is, she decides to show Nori one of their cave paintings, illustrating that one of the Stores a long time ago ventured off to a place that he saw in his dreams called the Suzette, which is just the Shire, by the way. Gundabale thinks that she is the one to gather up all the remaining Stores because the Shire has been found, but no, in fact, she isn't. Apparently, for some reason, even though the Harfoots could never find the Shire, they decided to just keep wandering, even though you'd think the logical thing to do would be to return home after your failed exploration. Meanwhile, the skeleton people have showed up at the front door in search of the Harfoots. Remember how this place was supposed to be a super secret village? Yeah, well, they just walk right in like it's nothing. The first thing the main skeleton man does is slap the fuck out of Gundabale.
Are you talking backsass to me?
Although why he does this, I have no idea, because he immediately helps her up afterward. He asks where the Harfoots are, because obviously he assumes that the Stores are hiding them. But when Gundabale responds that she has no idea what they are talking about, they just straight up leave. Instead of having a look around for themselves, they just apparently are gonna take Gundabale's word for it. Skip forward to episode 6, and we're back with not Gandalf and Tom Bombadil. Assuming based on the dialogue spoken here, not Gandalf has been staying with Tom for some time now, since Tom says, every trial you have faced so far, you have failed. However, it doesn't make sense for a significant amount of time to have passed, because the show presents this plot branch as well as the other story branch back with Nori and Poppy to be happening synchronously. But as we'll see in the next scene, Nori and Poppy's storyline seems to be going through time much slower. So it's very confusing how exactly these plot lines are matching up at this point. The only other thing of note here from this short scene is a poorly placed joke before it cuts away to Nori and Poppy. So I'll finish off this section with not Gandalf first and then circle back to the two gremlins after. So not Gandalf and Tom Bombadil venture to find not Gandalf a staff. Once the two of them have reached the spot, and not Gandalf sees the unending amount of trees, he fears that it will take too long to find his staff as well as save Nori, since he saw in a vision earlier that she was going to be in some kind of trouble in the near future. And so he asked Tom to temporarily leave to save his friend and then return afterwards. However, Tom Bombadil says that he has to stay if he is to choose the path of his destiny, although why is entirely unclear. Not Gandalf saving Nori and his destiny to face off against evil do not conflict with each other. So the fact that Tom Bombadil is making him choose here merely serves as a contrived sense of drama. Circling back to the Harfoots, Nori challenges Gundabale by saying that they should just leave, in order to be free of the oppression of the skeleton people. And in response, Gundabale has to explain the value of staying put in one spot and having an actual home. Now I find it a little confusing that Nori doesn't understand the value of a home by this point, because as we saw earlier in the season, Nori confessed to not Gandalf that she really wanted a home. So the fact that Gundabale has to spell this out for her, even though logically she should already know this, doesn't make any sense. We then cut to these two idiots trying to conduct small talk. Poppy and Miramac I guess are confirmed to be a thing now, and sadly I had to watch them awkwardly try to convey romantic interest in each other. Not only is this short scene here insufferable to watch, but the more time goes by, I'm really starting to wonder why Miramac is even in this TV show. He has served next to no purpose in progressing the story, and has only thus far served as a means for Nori and Poppy getting to safety earlier in the season. His inclusion is absolutely unnecessary beyond that. And every time he is on screen and I have to listen to him speak, I continue to lose more and more brain cells. Moments later, Poppy tells Nori that she thinks that they should stay to fight for not Gandalf, because they now both believe that he is somehow important. I'm fine with her coming to this realization, because obviously if this guy is just summoning sand tornadoes out of thin air, then yeah, he's probably pretty important. What makes no sense, however, is how exactly you think you are going to be able to defeat the skeleton people without the aid of not Gandalf. And as far as they are aware, there is no indication that he is coming. But hey, if you want to try your best, be my guest, because logically it should end up with them dying, and that would really help out the story a lot if they were just gone. Skip forward, nothing happens in episode 7, so we're on to episode 8. Not Gandalf walks into the Stoor's village, and nobody is there. How exactly he found this place, considering that it's supposed to be hidden, and why he thinks that Nori and Poppy are here, who knows? I'm not saying that it isn't possible that he could have made this discovery, or why he knows that the two gremlins are here, but we don't see how he came to these discoveries. This is a major plot gap that the show just doesn't care to depict in the slightest, because the writers aren't concerned in the slightest about convincingly getting from point A to point B. So then the Dark Wizard shows up to meet not Gandalf, and the same shit applies here. How the Dark Wizard knew how to get here, and how he knew that not Gandalf would be here, I have no idea. If you want to chalk this all up to magic shit, then just be my guest. However, the show never explicitly states or shows us that magic was the reason that they knew all this information. So Dark Wizard tries to convince not Gandalf to come with him so that he can learn everything about himself and gain everything that there is to gain, in an effort to defeat Sauron. And he's admittedly doing a better job at this point at convincing not Gandalf to join his side, certainly better than Tom Bombadil has done, who has really only been depicted as a prick and doesn't give a shit about the lives of not Gandalf's friends. But Dark Wizard's plans fall off the rails when his skeleton minions show up and fuck everything up for him. So after Skeleton Man threatens Dark Wizard to hold up his end of the bargain, Dark Wizard forces him into a wall, killing him. So I guess that's just it for Skeleton Man. We've had an entire season with him, and still know next to nothing about him or his motivations other than he wants to be healed. He has merely served as a device to move the plot forward, and is nothing more beyond that. It's also worth noting here that Dark Wizard has saved Nori and Poppy's life, giving not Gandalf even more reason to trust him now and join his side. But instead of continuing his ploy to get not Gandalf on his side, and likely exploit him for his powers, he just decides to come out and effectively say that he is evil. Are you kidding me? How dumb can this show get? My god. Not Gandalf refuses naturally, so Dark Wizard puts him in a force freeze, and as he walks off, decides to level the village with boulders. As he's leaving, he says something along the lines of, "Hopefully this will give you a taste of the suffering that Sauron will inflict." And he says it in a manner as if he's trying to still convince not Gandalf to join his side, as if this is somehow going to convince him to join you, killing an entire village worth of innocent civilians. Not a good plan, buddy. Cut to the next day, and the village has been destroyed. The stewards decide that it is unsalvageable, but surely if you just move all the rocks out of the way, you can rebuild this pretty quickly. But nah, time to move on, I guess. Nori then just decides out of thin air that it's time for her and not Gandalf to split up and follow their separate paths. Thank fucking God. I hope we never have to see this smelly hobbit again. But why do I think they'll find a way to work her back in the story for no apparent reason? You know what? I'm actually confident that they'll do that. So till next time, Nori Brandyfoot. Nori leaves not Gandalf behind, and as he turns and walks in the opposite direction, he trips on a stick and hey, look! It's his staff! Jesus Christ. I literally could not think of a less interesting way for not Gandalf to find his staff. But obviously, this is what they decided to go with. Just so unimaginative. Not Gandalf returns to Tom Bombadil, claiming that he realizes it was all a test. This is an instance where the show greatly overexplains what should have been obvious. But the writers think you are idiots, so they have to spell it out for you. Tom Bombadil says to not Gandalf that a wizard doesn't choose his name. But literally in the very next shot, not Gandalf chooses a name for himself. He remembers that all the stewards were calling him Grand Elf for some reason. So he combines the two words, switches out a couple letters, and not Gandalf has now graduated to becoming Gandalf. But to call this version of Gandalf, I think would be an insult to Ian McKellen. So this version of Gandalf, for future seasons, I will refer to as Gandoof. Gandoof and Tom Bomb sit by the fire and sing a song about Tom Bomb. Wow, that's pretty arrogant of him. Dark Wizard looks at the sky, contemplates why he didn't just kill Gandoof when he had the chance, cause now he's going to have to deal with him in later seasons. Oh wait, I know why, because the writers are setting themselves up to add contrived drama. And that's it. That's it for Rune. In summary, the Rune subplot is an absolute insufferable display to see unfold. Not only do I think that this is the worst subplot in the show, it is also the most disconnected from the larger narrative. Disconnected to the point where you question why this story is even included in the show. I know why, of course, cause you remember the person from the thing that you really like, right? If you wanted to make a Gandalf storyline, then just make a Gandalf show, cause having to constantly cut here is negatively affecting the pacing of the overarching narrative of all the other storylines. The only connection that can be made is Dark Wizard and Gandoof have mentioned Sauron a couple of times. That's it. They also, for some reason, felt the need to throw in the origin story of the hobbits in the show about Sauron creating the Rings of Power. Why they felt the need to do this, and why they thought that general audiences would give a shit about the halflings discovering the Shire, I don't know. These versions of the hobbits, these prehistoric hobbits, the Harfoots, are so disconnected and so different from the hobbits that we see in the Peter Jackson trilogies that they can't even really rely on nostalgia for the other thing to keep the people interested. The Rune subplot was a chore to get through, and thank God we are over now. So let's move on to the Numenor subplot, shall we? And sadly, it doesn't get much better. We kick off the Numenor subplot with Elendil letting Beric the horse go, after he is unable to control him, due to Beric being so close to Isildur and presumably being upset that Isildur has been lost to the forest. It's kind of fucked up on Elendil's part that he just let Beric wander off into the forest, knowing that it just got obliterated by the volcano and is now unsafe to travel through, but I'm willing to let it slide considering that it's made clear that Elendil is no longer able to help him, since Isildur and Beric's hearts and spirits have been combined after riding into battle, as per the explanation back in Season 1. Jump back to Numenor, and the funeral for the now dead king is underway. Aarion approaches Elendil to express her grievances about the new Queen Regent, saying that he shouldn't feel bad about his son's presumed death because she was the cause of his death, not him. However, this isn't entirely true, because ultimately, Elendil was the one that allowed his son to come along to fight a stupid war against the orcs, fueled by Galadriel's idiocy. So really, I think I probably would blame Elendil more than I would blame Miriel. Moments later, a random woman approaches Miriel and slaps the fuck out of her in the face. The reason she does this is because she is deeply upset that her son died in the battle in the Southlands. and ultimately blames Muriel for her death. Now this woman should be thrown off a cliff for assaulting the queen in the way that she does. There's also the other question of how this woman was able to just walk right up to the queen so easily, especially when you take into account that she's blind. The guards just stand there and do nothing. But instead of being arrested for this grave insult, Muriel decides to give her a big hug. Jesus Christ. I can understand that Muriel might feel bad for this woman who lost her son in the battle, but the fact that she wasn't angry at all, that she was just assaulted, and the fact that this woman seemingly isn't punished for her actions, I found downright stupid and unbelievable. Cut to later that night, Pharazôn walks in on Muriel to discuss the topic of dresses for her coronation. In his hands are two different color dresses. Crimson for Numenor's future, and white for Numenor's past. Why these two colors represent these two things, who knows? The show doesn't give an answer to this, and I guess we're just going to have to accept it as fact because Pharazôn said so. We then have a scene of attempted political drama. Pharazôn, Kemen, Aarion, and Lord Belzegar sit around a table and discuss how they all believe that Muriel is unfit to rule. Lord Belzegar is only in this scene as a means of delivering exposition, letting the audience know that apparently Pharazôn has a pretty good claim to the throne over Muriel. To my knowledge, this is the first time that this has ever been mentioned in the show. Not only is this very convenient, and only has been mentioned now for the first time ever because the writers need the plot to happen, but it's also a missed opportunity. The writers could have been planting the seeds of this development for Pharazôn's character all the way back in Season 1. It would have been interesting to see back in Season 1 Pharazôn know deep down that he has a better claim to the throne, but ultimately goes along with the secession of Muriel because he is too frightened of what the consequences of rising up against her may be. But then, after Muriel's debacle over in the Southlands, combined with the fact that she is now blind, ultimately gives Pharazôn the confidence to pursue his political coup. But instead, the writers decide to cram it all into this singular episode, because now it is relevant to the plot. Philandil approaches the table and asks why they of all people would be drinking in places surrounded by lower class people. He insults Kemen and threatens him to not speak ill of the queen again. Kemen is a bitch and backs down, and Philandil walks off. Although some of the dialogue and delivery here is pretty cringe, it's mostly functional from a plot and character perspective, so I don't have too many complaints here. Skip forward to the end of episode 3, and it's time for Muriel's coronation. As she makes her way to the throne and reaches out for the scepter thingy, a random woman screams out that she is a queen of lies. Now, why all these common people were allowed inside of the throne room for the coronation of a royal figure, I have no clue. And the fact that she isn't escorted out after this, and instead, Muriel once again does her "I feel your pain" speech, is just stupid. When Muriel asks the crowd whether anybody else has anything to say, Aarion speaks out and works her way towards saying that the reason that they went to war in Middle-earth was because Muriel took counsel from the Palantir. However, there is no way that she can be definitive about that because she never actually saw Muriel use the Palantir, and Muriel never stated to anybody that the reason that they went to war was because of the Palantir. So Aarion is completely pulling the shit out of her ass in order to make this point, even though she has no clue on its credibility. After Pharazôn states that no true ruler of Numenor would use an elvish artifact, Muriel responds that they need it, and a fight breaks out. But the fight is soon broken up by the arrival of an eagle. Now, earlier in the episode, Pharazôn stated that an eagle showing up to a coronation ceremony is very rare, indicating that whether that were to happen or not, it holds a great deal of value. And the fact that an eagle does show up to Muriel's coronation, you think would indicate to the people that she is in fact the right person to rule Numenor. But instead, Pharazôn walks up to the eagle, and because he does this, people for some retarded reason just believe that the eagle favors Pharazôn, and he's the ruler now. Wait. What? What the hell is going on? Isn't this Muriel's coronation ceremony? The eagle showed up for her, not for Pharazôn. Why would you think that it showed up for Pharazôn? Because this guy just started chanting his name? That's not how it works. But these people are idiots, and the writers need the plot to happen, so I guess Pharazôn is the leader now. Wow. In just one episode, the plotline is completely broken already. I can't take this political coup of Muriel seriously anymore because the setup has just been so ridiculously bad. Now skip forward to episode 5. Pharazôn is now the ruler of Numenor. He looks off upon the horizon of the city with Kemen at his side, and the two have a little chat. During this conversation, Pharazôn reveals his deeply rooted jealousy for the elves, which hints at the idea that he might want to challenge them in the future. Now this exposition dump really comes out of nowhere, largely due to the fact that Pharazôn has gotten so little characterization across the 2 seasons so far. Now if you have a deep knowledge of the source material, then that isn't a surprise. Because in the source material, it is well characterized that Pharazôn has a hatred for the elves, and even goes to war with them. But if you just look at the show itself, the show has given next to no hints that these are his beliefs about the elven race. So it really comes out of nowhere and wasn't built up to at all. The scene ends by Pharazôn tasking Kemen with a really important task, which isn't revealed to the audience, because the writers are addicted to these stupid and worthless cliffhangers. Why Pharazôn trusts Kemen of all people to carry out what is seemingly going to be such an important task, I don't know. Kemen so far hasn't really been characterized to be a capable person, so why Pharazôn is entrusting Kemen to carry out this task doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. We then cut to Miriel speaking with Elendil. Elendil informs Miriel that many people are still loyal to her, including the Sea Guard, which to my understanding is the entirety, or at least vast majority of their military. So if she really wanted to make a push to win the crown back, it seems like she'd be able to do so. However, she decides not to when Elendil describes that his vision was different from hers when he touched the Palantir. Hers was the destruction of the city by the sea, and his was not. This really highlights the fact that Miriel has put full trust into the will of the Palantir, even though, as seen by Elendil's vision, that the trajectory of the future can be changed based on the actions taken in the present. Why Miriel has such an unwavering faith in an elvish artifact that she'd let it entirely dictate her actions, I don't really know. It's not necessarily out of character, since she has been shown throughout the show to value the visions of the Palantir greatly, but the show does not do a good job of explaining why that is the case. Later, we see the Sea Guard that are loyal to Miriel all being forced to turn in their stuff, because they are being stripped of rank. When Elendil asks who is the cause of all this, Aarion is quick to reply in a very conceited way that it was her. In fact, Aarion's behavior throughout this scene is kind of strange. She talks as if her father is going to be very approving of what she has done, and that he should just accept that Pharazôn is the king now, which shows that she fundamentally misunderstands who her father is. Also, considering that she is the one carrying out this order, it must be assumed that Aarion is now a devout follower of Pharazôn to the point where she is going to carry out his agenda and has now become a person of power under him. And this all happened off-screen. Cut to the end of the episode, we see the faithful praying for the recently deceased at the oldest shrine in Numenor. However, they are quickly interrupted because here comes Darth Kemen. Presumably, this is the task that Pharazôn bestowed upon Kemen earlier in the episode, as a means of weakening his political opponents. I think now is a good time to highlight that Kemen has been fundamentally changed as a character at this point. He was once a little dweeb who just did everything that Aarion told him to, and is now a spineless little shit. And prior to this episode, that is not how he was characterized in the slightest. So seeing that this is now how the writers have decided his character is going to be is incredibly jarring. A massive brawl ensues after Valandil prevents Kemen from hitting Elendil, who is being held down by the guards. Valandil and Kemen fight one-on-one, which results in Valandil winning. Valandil has a sword up to Kemen's throat, and is about to kill him, but stops when Elendil orders him to. Valandil, for some reason, decides to drop the sword right next to Kemen, although he very clearly could have dropped it into the pool right next to him. Why he would be so stupid as to drop it here, I have no idea. But it results in him getting killed, cause he turns his back to Kemen, slowly starts to walk away. Kemen picks up the sword and stabs him in the stomach. Instead of killing him face to face like a man, Kemen waits until the fight is over and his back is turned, once again emphasizing that Kemen is now a spineless little shit. Skip forward to episode 6, and Elendil has been brought forth before Pharazôn to face judgment for the crimes he committed. Crimes, quote-unquote, because Kemen said so. He is told that because of his service to the kingdom, he can go free as long as he renounces his crimes, which he does. But he also has to swear loyalty to Pharazôn, which he does not. Elendil refuses to swear his loyalty to Pharazôn, saying that the true ruler of Numenor is in fact Miriel, and that he is the actual traitor. However, I don't think Pharazôn actually is a traitor, because according to our current understanding of how this monarchy works, he hasn't broken any rules. According to the show's own rules that it's established, if the eagle shows up for you, then you're the ruler. Yes, I know that is fucking stupid, and it's questionable at best whether or not the eagle actually showed up for Pharazôn on his behalf, but regardless, that is what happened. And because of it, Pharazôn is the king now. So Elendil saying this isn't actually true, even though the show presents it to be as such. Skip forward, Elendil waits in his cell as the sea worm is summoned. Aarion comes to see Elendil and begs one last time for him to swear his allegiance to Pharazôn. However, this is just completely redundant considering how loyal Elendil has been shown to be towards Miriel. The show presents Aarion as if her father is the most important thing to her in her life, when she utters the line, "I can't lose you too." However, her actions have directly contradicted this. So I'm left wondering how much she actually cares about her father that she'd help Pharazôn usurp Miriel, the queen that her father is loyal to. Yes, I understand that Aarion doesn't like Miriel because she blames her for Isildur's presumed death. But Elendil has told her, time and time again, that Miriel is not the one to blame for his death. So I don't understand why she can't get that information through her skull. Aarion has played an instrumental part in getting Elendil into the position that he is in now. So I have a hard time believing that she actually cares about Elendil and more notably, his judgment. When Miriel enters the cell and Aarion exits, Miriel commands Elendil that he bow to Pharazôn, but Elendil refuses, saying that he knows that she is the true heir and therefore won't bow to Pharazôn. This is kinda confusing because Elendil is apparently willing to die for his loyalty to Miriel, but also won't accept a direct order from Miriel. This is a direct contradiction in logic, which the writers clearly did not realize that they were writing themselves into. Now, on to the trial by Abyss. Elendil has accepted his fate to be judged by the Valar, but why Pharazôn agreed to let him face the judgment of the trial by Abyss, I don't really know. Pharazôn is treating this like it's a form of execution, and he is for sure going to die. However, that isn't certain considering that this is one of their ancient trial methods. And surely there must have been instances of people surviving this trial. So the fact that Pharazôn would agree to subject Elendil to something when it isn't a guarantee whether he's going to die or not, I don't find believable considering that Pharazôn absolutely wants this man dead, since he didn't swear loyalty to him and is a political threat to him. Before Elendil is thrown in the pool, Miriel shows up and demands that she be judged in Elendil's stead, since the crime was committed in her name. And according to the law, she is allowed to do that, 'cause of course she can. We've gone too long without a plot convenience. Elendil resists Miriel's demands somewhat. However, he probably could have resisted harder and begged harder to Pharazôn to take him instead. But he ultimately decides to go along with it, and Miriel walks into the pool to be judged by the giant sea worm. After having an underwater staring contest, the worm throws her out of the pool, deeming her innocent. After this, Elendil helps her up and starts chanting that she is the queen of the sea. And I guess people are going along with it, because they start chanting that she's the queen of the sea. And I guess Pharazôn is just not the king anymore. I'm confused. Does her being deemed innocent by the giant sea worm just mean that she is innocent of any crimes? Or does it mean that she is innocent as well as the Valar favor her to be the ruler of Numenor? The show shows us that it's the latter, however, why this is the case is never made clear. So I guess Miriel is the queen again. Yay! Skip forward to episode 8. Pharazôn has gathered the leaders of the faithful to convince them that the reason Miriel was able to survive the trial by Abyss was due to her being allied with Sauron, and for some reason everybody just accepts this as fact. Although Pharazôn has no possible way of proving that it was Sauron's power which kept Miriel alive. Lord Belzegar then states that from this moment on, that all citizens who are part of the faithful are now considered traitors. What the fuck? Nobody is going to question this. Nobody is going to challenge the validity of this strange document that Faramir just happened to pull out of his ass? How does Lord Belzegar have the authority to order this? Isn't Miriel the queen again? Wasn't that the whole point of the last scene? Who fucking knows? The writers just want their dumbass plot to happen, so they will pull out any contrivance necessary in order to do so. The soldiers then begin rounding up all the citizens who are part of the faithful. How they are able to tell who is who considering they have to go through the entire city, and it's not like the faithful wear armbands around them to identify themselves. Who knows? Just go with it. After Elendil is able to evade being captured, he immediately goes to rescue Miriel. This is most definitely in character for him, but I question how Miriel has not been already arrested by the time that Elendil would have been able to reach her. Elendil tries to get Miriel to escape with him, but she declines, because of course she does. She claims that her place is here, and that Elendil should escape by himself. Miriel then just casually gives Elendil Narsil, which as we all know will later become the most important sword in all of Middle-earth's history. But instead of making this moment something that was naturally built up to, it instead merely serves as a key jangling scene to remind us of the thing from the thing. Cause wow, isn't that cool? The last thing that we see from Numenor is during Poppy's voiceover monologue. We see that Elendil has managed to escape, and Muriel has been arrested. Rather conveniently after she could have her scene with Elendil. And that's it. That's it for Season 2 in Numenor. In summary, the Numenor subplot is an absolute failed attempt at writing a political drama in every single way. The characters are a bunch of idiots and constantly act on things that make no sense. The show also constantly breaks its own rules, while simultaneously not being clear enough with other rules that the characters just abide by. What was supposed to be the next interesting chapter in the story of what will eventually become the downfall of Numenor sadly devolves itself into a joke that I can't take seriously whatsoever. And with all that said, the Numenor subplot for Season 2 is done. And that's it. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. We have finally made it through all the storylines of Season 2. So since now we've made it all the way through, what are my overall thoughts of Season 2 as a whole? Well, to be quick and concise about it, Season 2 is just straight up terrible, and might even be worse than Season 1. And I hate that I have to say that. I obviously don't want to hate this show. I would much prefer if this could be a positive exploration of how good it is. I want the stories of Middle-earth to be told well. I've never been the one that has read Tolkien's original work, but I am someone that greatly respects and grew a deep appreciation and love for it in the Peter Jackson adaptations. The stories of Middle-earth are some of the most inspiring and well-written stories in all of fantasy. They have impacted my life greatly, and will continue to inspire me for the rest of my life. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, for all its flaws, have been instrumental in shaping my love for filmmaking and storytelling. So when I see something like Rings of Power, something that is such an insult and betrayal to an IP that I love and has impacted me greatly, I'm obviously going to take great offense to it. And I certainly do. It is downright disgusting how terrible Rings of Power is, and how clearly the showrunners don't respect or care about the original source material that they are taking from. I am not confident that they are going to learn from their mistakes. Season 3 is not going to be any better in the slightest, because their ego is just straight up too big. And we have to keep calling out this bullshit for what it is. Because if we don't, then there's no chance in hell that it is ever going to get better. And with that, that's going to do it for Rings of Power Season 2. If you've stuck around to the end of this video and you've made it through the entire series, then I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to you. These videos have taken a long time to script out and make, so thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts. If you have any of your own thoughts about Rings of Power, whether it's good, bad, something you feel like you need to get off your chest, then please, feel free to take to the comments below, because I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. But with all that said, that's going to do it for today. I will see you guys in the next one.